What if much of what we think we understand about the world, others, and ourselves is nothing more than a blurry echo of what others have taught us to believe? What if most of our ideas aren't clear thoughts, but foggy reflections of prejudice, habit, and fear? There's nothing more unsettling than suspecting that what we've believed our whole lives might never have been born in our own minds, but simply stuck to us, like dust on an old coat. And yet, even more unsettling is going through life without ever asking that question. Because although the human mind is capable of incredible feats, it's also a master at deceiving itself. Michel de Montaigne, that French nobleman who locked himself in a tower to converse with books and with his own spirit, didn't claim to have definitive answers, nor did he try to. His strength lay not in certainty, but in doubt. He didn't seek to impose a truth, but to untangle the knot of what we think we know. In a world that shouts certainties every hour of the day, his voice sounds like a whisper urging us to pause, to look inward, and calmly ask, "What do I know?" This is no trivial question. It's a kind of spiritual dynamite. To ask it seriously is to crack open the routine of thought. Because it's not about assuming everything is relative and surrendering to cynicism. It's about learning to doubt what seems obvious, to see our own thinking as a foggy landscape, and to move, step by step, toward clearer ground. That clarity isn't some absolute light, it's radical honesty. It's knowing when we're improvising answers out of fear of silence, when we're repeating things we heard without chewing on them, when we're defending ideas not because they're true, but because they've become comfortable. Thinking clearly, then, isn't a technical skill. It's a deeper way of being alive. It's an attitude that takes courage. Because clear thought, real thought, isn't always pleasant or comforting. It hurts. It forces us to dismantle illusions that gave us security, to see ourselves without masks, to admit we're more confused than we let on. But that pain isn't destructive. On the contrary, it's fertile. It cleans. It prepares the ground for a more genuine understanding, one less polluted by the noise of the world. Montaigne believed the first kind of clarity comes from recognizing how little we truly know. And he didn't say it with despair, but with relief. Embracing our ignorance doesn't paralyze us. It frees us. It lifts the burden of pretending to have wisdom we don't possess. It allows us to explore with curiosity instead of arrogance. It invites us to think like intelligent children, not like adults who pretend to have it all figured out. Maybe that's why his writing still resonates today, because it brings us back to the starting point, to the place where thinking stops being a defense mechanism and becomes an act of discovery. Of course, living this way isn't easy. Society trains us from an early age to produce answers, not to ask questions. We're rewarded for having firm opinions, not for pausing to wonder whether those opinions have roots. The education system, the workplace, even social media, revolve around the appearance of clarity, not its substance. We're pushed to pick sides, to comment on everything, to project confidence even when deep down we don't understand what we're feeling or why we're acting the way we are. In this context, thinking clearly becomes an act of resistance. It means swimming against the current of haste, superficiality, and noise. And to do that, we must start from within. That's why Montaigne insisted so much on introspection, not as a narcissistic exercise, but as a way of sharpening our judgment. He observed his emotions, his contradictions, his quirks, and described them without shame. It was his way of cleaning the lens through which he saw the world. Because he understood that no one can think clearly about the outside world if they haven't first explored their inner world. And a quick glance isn't enough. We have to dig, get uncomfortable, ask ourselves questions with no easy answers. Why do I believe this? Where did this idea come from? Is it really mine, or was it handed to me without me noticing? This kind of self-examination doesn't trap us in ourselves. It makes us more lucid in how we see others. Because the more we recognize our own confusion, the more careful we are when judging others. Clarity doesn't create arrogance, it creates humility. Those who have thought deeply know how fragile their knowledge is, and thus they become more open, more patient, more attentive. Like Montaigne, who could write about emperors and horses, death and dreams, without ever losing that tone of wonder that only the truly wise possess. In today's world, saturated with information, clear thinking has become rare and precious. Because it doesn't depend on how much we know, it depends on how we process what we know. We live in an age where everything is shouted, where ideas are thrown like weapons instead of offered like bridges. Amid all that noise, voices like Montaigne's are a balm. They remind us that thinking is, above all, an act of listening. Listening to others, to the world, but most importantly, to ourselves, without self-deception. And once we learn how to do that, everything changes. The way we make decisions, the way we talk, the way we judge, the way we suffer, and the way we love. Because a mind that has learned to see clearly is a freer mind. Not because it has more answers, but because it has learned to live better with the questions. Maybe that's why, at the end of his life, Montaigne didn't present himself as a philosopher who had discovered great truths, but as a man who had learned to live with himself. And that, ultimately, is what clear thinking really is. To stop running from who we are and to dare to face the chaos, the beauty, the ignorance, and the potential that live in our minds. Without masks. Without noise. Without fear. Only with a question that changed everything. What do I know? Thinking clearly isn't a destination, it's a way of walking. It's a path full of stumbles, where each step forces us to let go of something we thought was solid. Sometimes it hurts. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. But it also frees us. Because it allows us to live more honestly, more presently, more connected to what we truly feel and think. It's a kind of clarity that isn't imposed with force, but cultivated with patience, like a flame that doesn't seek to dazzle, but gently illuminates the corner where we stand. And to do that, you have to start from within. That's why Montaigne insisted so much on introspection, not as a narcissistic exercise, but as a way to refine judgment. He observed his emotions, his contradictions, his quirks, and described them without shame. It was his way of cleaning the lens through which he saw the world. Because he understood that no one can think clearly about the external if they haven't first explored the internal. And a quick glance isn't enough. You have to dig, get uncomfortable, ask yourself questions that don't have easy answers. Why do I believe this? Where does this idea come from? Is it really mine, or was it handed to me without me noticing? This kind of self-examination doesn't lock us inside ourselves. It makes us sharper in how we relate to others. Because the more we recognize our own confusion, the more careful we are when judging others. Clarity doesn't create arrogance, it creates humility. Those who have thought deeply know how fragile their knowledge is, and because of that, they become more open, more patient, more attentive. Like Montaigne, who could speak about emperors and horses, about death and sleep, without ever losing that tone of wonder that true wisdom always carries. In this world saturated with information, clarity of thought has become rare and precious. Because it doesn't depend on how much we know, but on how we process what we know. We live in an age where everything is shouted, where ideas are thrown like projectiles instead of offered as bridges. In that noise, voices like Montaigne's are a balm. They remind us that thinking is, above all, an act of listening. Listening to others, listening to the world, but most of all, listening to ourselves without self-deception. And when you learn to do that, everything changes. The way you make decisions changes. The way you talk, the way you judge, the way you suffer, and the way you love. Because a mind that has learned to see clearly is a freer mind. Not because it has more answers, but because it has learned to live better with the questions. Perhaps that's why, at the end of his life, Montaigne didn't present himself as a philosopher who had discovered great truths, but as a man who had learned to live with himself. And that, ultimately, is what it means to think clearly, to stop running away from who we are and to dare to look directly at the chaos, the beauty, the ignorance, and the possibility that live in our minds. Without masks. Without noise. Without fear. Just with the question that changed everything. What do I know? Thinking clearly is not a destination, it's a way of walking. It's a path full of stumbles, where every step asks us to let go of an idea we once thought was solid. Sometimes it hurts. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. But it also sets us free. Because it lets us live more honestly, more presently, more in tune with what we truly feel and think. It's a kind of lucidity that doesn't impose itself with force, but is cultivated with patience. Like a flame that doesn't try to dazzle, but simply lights up the corner where we're standing. For Montaigne, thinking wasn't an abstract exercise, it was a way to live with more awareness. He didn't write to teach others, but to discover himself. In his words, you can feel the internal struggle, the hesitation, the genuine search. There's none of that cold, systematic tone you find in manuals. Instead, there's a warm, human voice, one that dares to confess its mistakes, its fears, its contradictions. That sincerity is what makes him so relevant, so relatable, so necessary. Thinking clearly starts there, with the courage not to pretend. The mind becomes clouded every time we try to maintain an image that doesn't match what we're really feeling. How often do we speak as if we know, while inside we're full of doubt? How often do we passionately defend an opinion, not because we truly believe it, but because we're afraid of looking bad? That constant tension between what we show and what we are creates a fog that keeps us from seeing clearly. Montaigne understood this. That's why, instead of speaking from a pedestal, he wrote from his failures. Clarity isn't the same as perfection. It's more like the result of a clear-eyed look at imperfection. Only someone who accepts their own fragility can begin to think with lucidity, because they don't need to protect an inflated ego or prove anything to anyone. They allow themselves to see things as they are, not as they wish they were. And that's where a different kind of thinking emerges, one that doesn't shine for its flawless logic, but for its emotional truth. A way of thinking that doesn't aim to win, but to understand. But understanding demands attention. And in that, we are deeply distracted. We live in an age where thinking has become a surface-level activity. We jump from one idea to another without going deep into any of them. We consume opinions like they're news, memes, or entertainment. There's no pause. No space for an idea to mature, to grow inside us like a seed. Hurry is the enemy of clear thought. Because thinking takes time. It takes silence. It takes discomfort. Montaigne found that space in solitude. He withdrew to observe his inner world, not because he despised company, but because he knew that the noise outside often serves to drown out the noise within. And how important it is to learn to listen to that inner noise. Because inside us live not just ideas, but wounds, emotions, inherited beliefs, nameless fears. All of that shapes the way we think. All of that clouds our clarity. That's why thinking clearly isn't just a logical operation. It's an act of emotional honesty. It means looking inward with the same rigor we use to examine the world. And we don't always like what we find. Sometimes we discover that our convictions weren't so solid, that our decisions came more from fear than from freedom, that our ideas rested on unchallenged prejudices. In that moment, many choose to go back to the fog. Pretend they didn't see. Close their eyes. Keep repeating what they've learned. But others, the brave ones, choose to stay with the discomfort. And in that discomfort, they begin to see more clearly. It's not a quick process, nor a glorious one. Often, it's lonely. It requires giving up the search for applause and beginning the search for meaning. It requires letting go of other people's judgment as a measure of validity and trusting your own experience as a compass. Montaigne spoke from himself, but he didn't lock himself inside himself. On the contrary, his introspection made him more compassionate, more open, more able to live with differences. Because he understood that clear thinking doesn't make us all the same, it diversifies us. It doesn't try to reduce the world to a formula, but expands our vision to embrace its complexity. And that expansion also means knowing how to listen. Truly listen. Not just hear what confirms our ideas, but open ourselves to what's different. Thinking clearly also means recognizing that we don't think alone. That we are shaped by voices that live within us. Those of our parents, our teachers, our fears, our desires. Being aware of those voices is not an academic exercise. It's an act of liberation. Because only when we identify them can we choose which ones to follow and which ones to leave behind. In that sense, clarity doesn't arrive with a great revelation. It comes through small gestures. In the pause before responding, in the question that unsettles, in the decision to carefully read something that doesn't confirm our ideas, in the silence that allows an emotion to speak its truth. These are everyday acts, almost invisible, yet deeply transformative. Because each of them sharpens our perspective, brings us back to what's essential, and connects us with a deeper form of intelligence. An intelligence not made only of data, but of sensitivity. Because a clear mind is also an empathetic one, able to see others' pain, to imagine other realities, to accept that life doesn't fit neatly into our frameworks. And what a relief it is to live that way. Not from the rigidity of someone who believes they are right, but from the openness of someone who wants to understand. Not from the urgency of someone who needs an answer, but from the calm of someone who knows that some questions matter more than any conclusion. Perhaps, in the end, thinking clearly is a form of love. Love for the truth even when it hurts. Love for freedom even when it confuses us. Love for the world not for what it gives us, but for what it reveals. And love for ourselves, not as perfect beings, but as tireless seekers of meaning, even in the midst of confusion. Montaigne didn't have a system, or a method, or a doctrine. What he had was radical honesty, a commitment to his own search, a capacity to see without embellishment, to write without pretense, to live without masks. And maybe that's what we need today more than ever, fewer certainties and more sincerity. Less speech and more reflection. Less noise and more clarity. Thinking clearly isn't something you do once and then you're done. It's a way of being alive, a delicate and courageous way of inhabiting the world. It's not about reaching a final truth or having an infallible mind. It's about staying alert, being aware of our own traps, walking humbly between what we think we know and what we're willing to discover. Montaigne reminds us of this with every page written from his doubts, his fears, his moments of lucidity, not to impose, but to invite. And by following his voice, we find our own. Not the one that repeats, not the one that adapts out of fear, but the one that observes, feels, dares to think without armor. We need to make peace with discomfort, because seeing clearly means questioning what we took for granted, letting go of certainties, losing a sense of security. And that's not easy. Many times, we confuse thinking with being right, with winning arguments, with proving what others can't see. But thinking clearly has nothing to do with that. It's quieter, more honest, and for that very reason, more transformative. It doesn't seek to impress, but to understand. It doesn't aim to have the last word, but to arrive at a truer one. It's an inner movement that isn't shown, but felt. In the way we treat others, in how we face uncertainty, in how we dwell in pain without dressing it up or denying it. Clarity is not a spectacle, but an intimate practice. And in that practice, there are no shortcuts. Sometimes we want to think better as if it were a matter of willpower, as if simply deciding to do so were enough. But the truth is, thinking clearly requires a deeper kind of cleansing. We have to look at the emotions that cloud us, the desires we disguise as reasons, the wounds that make us cling to certain ideas. None of that is resolved with quick techniques. It takes constant work, honesty, observation, humility. Montaigne knew this. That's why he wrote so much about himself. Not out of egotism, but out of awareness. Because he understood that without knowing oneself, one cannot think clearly. And without thinking clearly, it's very easy to get lost. Lost in the opinions of others, in imposed narratives, in intellectual trends, in the need to always have an answer. But those who allow themselves not to know, who dare to leave room for doubt, begin to see more clearly, because they no longer look to confirm what they want, but to discover what is. They no longer defend their ideas like a flag, but examine them like terrain they are walking through. They are no longer afraid to change their mind, because they know that thinking is precisely changing. Changing with meaning, with depth, with truth. In that process, we also learn to listen differently. Listening not to reply, but to understand. Listening not to be right, but to make space for the other. And how much lighter the mind becomes when we stop carrying the burden of needing to convince. When we stop using words as weapons and start using them as bridges. Clarity is not imposed, it's contagious. It's recognized in a calm tone, in a sincere question, in a gesture that shows more curiosity than certainty. Montaigne listened even when he wrote, because his texts are, at their core, conversations, with himself and with the reader. And in those conversations, a presence is felt, that of someone who doesn't want to dazzle, but to share what he is coming to understand. Perhaps that's why his reflections have survived the centuries. Because they don't cling to rigid truths, they vibrate with humanity. They don't speak from a place of superiority, but from the living experience of being a person who doubts, who fears, who observes. And that voice, even today, remains a refuge. In a world saturated with opinions, with noise, with ideas shouted without being heard, Montaigne reminds us that thinking can be an act of tenderness, of respect, for ourselves and for others, of trust that we don't need to have everything figured out to start seeing more deeply. Thinking clearly, in that sense, is also an act of freedom. Not the grandiose kind of freedom proclaimed with heroic gestures, but the quiet freedom of someone who doesn't need to hide behind canned phrases. Someone who can say, "I don't know." Someone who can change their mind without feeling they've betrayed anything. Someone who can observe an emotion without being swept away by it. Someone who can see in the other not a threat, but a mirror. That kind of freedom only arises when we stop fearing our own thoughts. When we stop fearing the thoughts of others. When we understand that thinking is not closing off, it is opening up. And opening up requires trust. Trust that we can hold uncertainty. Trust that not everything that questions us is an attack. Trust that error is part of the process.